1950s America regularly gets talked about like it was Camelot. Dad going to the office in a fancy suit, Mom at home in her apron and pearls, the kids on their bikes till the streetlights come on. All of them safe because everybody supposedly knew everybody. We treat it as this lost moment when things were simpler, cleaner, and basically good. It's pure Leave It to Beaver Americana. But it turns out that's just the story we tell ourselves and not the whole picture. Gregory Wilson's The Girl Next Door takes that postcard image, the small town, the summer break, the house next door where all the kids hang out, and drags us into the basement underneath it. Down there in the dark, away from prying eyes and safely hidden behind the facade of suburban America, we see a much bleaker truth. Evil and cruelty aren't new, and if you peel back the shiny veneer of Camelot, there was already rot eating away at the American dream. The film, based on Jack Ketchum's 1989 novel of the same name, is a horrifying tale of abuse and moral failings. It's a story about how evil prospers when good men, or in this case a good boy, does nothing. And the most harrowing part of all? Was based on a true crime even more horrific than what's captured on the screen or the pages of the novel. It is a story that turns nostalgia into a weapon. A tale that illustrates how easy it is for normal people to perpetuate and live with monstrous things as long as these monstrous things are hidden or happening to someone else. It's a bleak and haunting film that raises the uncomfortable question of what we do in a similar situation. This is the story of The Girl Next Door. But before we get to the film, let's talk about the horrific event that inspired it. In 1965, Sylvia Likens and her sister Jenny were left in the care of a woman named Gertrude Banashevsky while their parents worked out of town with a carnival. Gertrude was the mother of girls the Likens sisters knew through school. Over the next few months, Gertrude, her children, and a rotating cast of neighborhood kids starved, beat, burned, and degraded Sylvia until she died from her injuries. Those injuries and abuses are so awful, I'm not going to go into detail here. Jack Ketchum's novel and the film version of The Girl Next Door are a fictionalized version of these horrific events. Ketchum moves the story from 1965 back to 1958, changes the names of everyone involved, and even toned down some of the most horrific elements of the crime. But the story is largely the same. Ketchum was obsessed with the rot festering just beneath the surface of the American dream. White picket fences, church on Sunday, and behind the curtains, a level of cruelty you'd expect to hear about in war tribunals, not in suburban Indiana. One of the more interesting changes Ketchum makes is how the story is framed. The novel gives the story a third-party narrator, an adult named David, looking back on his childhood decades later and telling us about the girl he loved and the ways he failed her. When Gregory Wilson adapts the book in 2007, he keeps that framing device. The film opens in the present, with adult David in New York, flashing back to 1958 when Meg and her little sister Susan came to live with Ruth Chandler and her 3 sons. It's a low-budget psychological horror movie that went straight to DVD, but it quickly built a cult following and a reputation in online horror circles as one of those films you'd dare people to watch once and then never revisit. Anyway, as a teenager, David meets Meg, newly orphaned, and moved in with her Aunt Ruth and her kids. He's immediately smitten. Meg is his first real crush, and the film sticks close to his point of view as he bounces between puppy love moments with Meg and increasingly ugly hangouts at Ruth's house. What we see is what he sees. Ruth's basement as a cool clubhouse at first, with beer, cigarettes, dirty jokes, and the way she lets boys talk about girls however they want. But then, where there is that same basement, slowly turns into a dungeon. David is not a bad kid, but he is part of the problem. He watches Ruth slap Meg down with misogynistic rants about being promiscuous. He hears Meg tell a cop that she's being abused and watches that report go nowhere. He sees her hanging in the basement and still doesn't run straight to an adult who might actually do something. Even when he loosens her ropes and urges her to escape, it's too little too late, and he lets himself be talked into small gestures instead of big risks. The film is about Ruth's cruelty first and foremost, but the framing device makes it equally about a boy learning what evil looks like and still choosing the path of least resistance. It really feels more like a confession than a horror story when you get right down to it. What makes Ruth so terrifying is that she doesn't show up as a monster from the moment she appears in the film. I think all of us grew up with friends who had the cool parents, the ones who let the kids curse, maybe let you drink if you were at the house and not going anywhere. The parents you often secretly wished were yours. Early in the film, Ruth fills that cool mom archetype perfectly. She smokes in the kitchen and hands out beers to teenage boys. She lets them swear and makes snide jokes about girls these days. Her house is the place kids want to be because the rules are looser there. She's less a parent and more an older peer. But then it all shifts in a very dark way. At first, the basement is just a sort of clubhouse where the kids gather to hang out, flirt, and talk. But gradually, Ruth's tone shifts, especially towards Meg. She starts with verbal attacks, calling her a liar, saying she's a bad influence on her sons. When Ralphie gropes Meg and she hits him, Ruth doesn't punish her son. Instead, she spanks Susan in front of Meg instead, forcing Meg to watch her sister take the pain. From there, the escalation begins to speed up. Verbal attacks become physical, which leads to locking Meg in the basement, tying her up, and starving her. The humiliation becomes sexualized. Ruth encourages the boys to strip Meg, to look at her, to carve words into her skin to degrade her, and somehow it gets even worse from there. What makes this feel like a cult rather than just one sadist is how Ruth trains the kids. She doesn't commit all these terrible acts on her own. She delegates them. She laughs along when the boys hurt Meg. She eggs them on. She frames the abuse as discipline and justice. The Scream Horror Magazine review nails this. She, quote, indoctrinates them into being sadists, grooming their behavior little by little. And in handing over the reins of exploiting the victim, the seeds of cruelty are sown in. At a certain point, she barely has to give orders. They just know what she wants. Underneath that is a very American kind of horror. A middle-class white woman, the kind the neighborhood trusts by default, who's using her social position and her maternal authority to build a micro-regime in her living room. She's the one parents leave their kids with. She's the one the local cop half flirts with. That's why she can get away with this for as long as she does. And on the other side of that ledger, we have the kids. The boys in the movie don't start out as monsters. They start out as bored suburban kids desperate for something to do. Ruth gives them a storyline. Here's a girl you can blame for anything. Here's a girl you can hurt, and nobody outside this house will ever know about it. The film and novel are blunt about the step-by-step desensitization. Kids can be inherently cruel on their own, but Ruth pushes them into something darker over time. She nurtures that cruelty, letting it fester and then weaponizing it. At first, they just repeat her insults. Then they push Meg around a little. Then they're helping tie her up. And they're burning her, touching her, laughing at things that would have horrified them a few weeks earlier. Every new outrage becomes normal. That's the real slippery slope descent into evil the movie is interested in. Not the progression of the wounds on Meg's body, so much as the progression of what these kids think is okay or acceptable. David sits slightly off to the side of that group. He's not as vicious as Ruth's sons. He doesn't participate in the worst acts, but he's still there, in the room, watching. He sneaks Meg water, he loosens knots, he whispers escape plans, but he never fully breaks from the group until the very end of the film. This tension between his feelings for Meg and his passivity is the film's quiet accusation. He knows exactly what's happening. He can see that Meg is terrified and that each day is worse than the last. But he also wants to keep being one of the boys, to keep his access to Ruth's house and to avoid getting in trouble himself. That push-pull is uncomfortably relatable, and the movie knows it. So you come to this central question. Is the girl next door effectively indicting bystanders like David, making us feel the weight of I knew and didn't act, or does it risk turning him into a safe audience surrogate, someone we forgive too easily because he's not as bad as the others and he cries about it later? The film doesn't really answer that, and that ambiguity is one of the things that makes it stick. This is one of the key areas the film explores, but the other is every bit as interesting because it really helps shatter the myth that things were so much nicer in the old days. Formally, The Girl Next Door is a period piece. The bulk of the story is set in 1958, in a small New Jersey town with all the usual trappings. Kids running around unsupervised, carnivals, the idea that everyone knows everyone. It taps directly into that nostalgic, simpler times iconography that American pop culture loves to romanticize. This is what makes the contrast of the film so sharp. The Chandler basement is the rotten core under the Norman Rockwell painting. Upstairs, Ruth could play the chatty neighbor or the stern mom. Outside, David can walk Meg home from the carnival. In the basement, the rules are different. It's a lawless zone that operates on whatever Ruth feels like that particular day. The film directly embraces this contrast. You go from bright outdoor scenes, kids at the fair, sunlight on the street, to dim, airless basement scenes where time blurs and Meg's world shrinks. It's not subtle, but it doesn't need to be. The point is that this is not horror in some exotic, distant location. It's horror in a house that looks like yours, on a street like yours, in a decade we love to look back at like it was some sort of utopia. There's a quiet critique of 1950s social norms baked directly into the narrative. The film suggests that nostalgia for that era conveniently forgets that bad things happening today often happened back then too. There's really nothing new under the sun when it comes to evil. Eventually, David does take decisive action. He sneaks down to the basement and sees that Meg is barely alive, and he sets a fire to draw attention to the situation. In the ensuing chaos, Ruth tries to put out the flames, and David finally snaps and kills her with Susan's crutch. The police show up, the boys get arrested, and on a plot level, our monster is dead. But it's also too little too late. Meg dies in the basement too, thanking David and telling him she loves him with her last breaths. There is no triumph in this moment. It is a failing of David, the system, and arguably society has all turned a blind eye to what was happening. The adult framing device comes back to underline this point. Decades later, David is still haunted by that summer. He has a job and a life, but this is the story he tells himself when he's alone. Time he watched a girl be tortured in a basement and only acted after the damage was irreparable. The film's last line, "It's what you do last that counts," serves as both a comfort and a condemnation. It lets David live with himself, but it never erases what happened. That's a pretty big break from the standard revenge horror template. There is no sense of moral balance being restored, no fantasy where righteous violence sets the world right again. All we're left with is a dead girl, a dead abuser, and a man who has to carry the knowledge that, for most of that summer, he chose the path of least resistance over justice and what was right. That's the kind of baggage that lingers with you forever if you have a soul. And for me, that's what makes The Girl Next Door so hard to shake. It isn't just disturbing because of what you see on screen. It's disturbing because of how easy it is to imagine people behaving exactly this way and then living with it. The movie pinballs between our fascination with the banality of evil and genuine anger at how communities fail their most vulnerable. Through it all, Wilson and author Jack Ketchum never cross the line. The film is hard to watch, but it doesn't exist merely to exploit the horrific events that inspired the tale for cheap thrills. It has something to say. It has points to make about the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia and the idea that everything was better in the good old days. It reminds us that being silent and looking the other way in the face of atrocity makes us complicit on some level. That's a lot of heavy lifting for an indie genre film, but The Girl Next Door pulls it off. If you do seek it out, go in knowing what you're walking into. Not funhouse scares or cathartic revenge, but a long stare into a very specific kind of American horror abyss. One that lived in a real basement and still lives in more places than anyone would suspect or wants to admit. If you go deeper into the actual Sylvia Likens case or into Ketchum's novel, I'd say do that carefully and keep some distance. These aren't stories you just binge and forget. These are the kind of things Joseph Conrad was getting at when he talked about the heart of darkness, how evil can live in any one of us when we set aside our soul and ignore our moral imperatives. Because if there's one thing the film is good for beyond its technical execution, it's this. It makes "I don't want to get involved" or "that's not my problem" sound a lot less harmless. Ready to perform another cinematic postmortem on a disturbing film? Then be sure to check out my video on Calvaire. You'll find a link here on the screen. I hope to see you over there.